Yes, yes, yes. And another, what you'd call, how shall we say it, warm day ahead of us, but they will not last. Now, it's not going to turn around and just go south on us, but for the next few days, it'll be a little cooler. And finally, some more rain, too, expected at the end of the week. No one, I think, in the agriculture industry is going to be complaining about that particular situation. Some of the things that I have coming up today: Steve Millington will be joining us a little later in the show, and I believe also, following Steve's visit, we're going to have a chat with our own prosecutor here from Twin Falls County, Grant Loebs, on any number of issues. And of course, he's also available to take some of your telephone calls. If you've got a legal question, he'll bat that around with you as well. So some of those things are coming up a little later in the program. In the meantime, I was hoping to reference a telephone message someone left me yesterday. And this was in relation to a discussion we were having on the air, for about 10 minutes yesterday, about the Air Force veteran who ended up getting, well, not charged, but was detained for a time after she approached some students who were desecrating a flag on the campus of Valdosta State University, that is in Georgia. The caller looked that up for me as well. Valdosta State University in Georgia. She approached them. They were walking on the flag. The flag was still on a pole. They'd thrown it down on the ground, and they were walking across the flag and telling everyone that would listen that they were maltreated in this country, that it was a slave country, and that they were slaves, and that they needed to break out from slavery, and that the flag was a symbol of that slavery. She snatched the flag, started walking away with it. They accused her of theft. Campus police arrived. They restrained her, gave the flag back to the students for more desecration. They wrestled her to the ground, this is the campus police, handcuffed her, and took her away. Now, she was not charged afterwards. I think because there's a public relations disaster looming here if that happens, when someone actually tries to save a flag from being, well, walked upon like that on pavement will eventually ruin the flag anyway. But she was right in saying that any flag that has been desecrated like that needs to be disposed of, which was why she picked up the flag. Since this story has broken, there has been a great deal of discussion in liberal media because what they are trying now to do is deflect you from any respect you have for what you may have done. And since this story actually ended up breaking, the story broke, I think, on Friday. And I think since that particular case happened, we have had what you would call a bit of a bloodletting by the American left over what exactly took place in this particular situation. To give you a little bit of background, her name is Michelle Manhart. She served for 14 years in the U.S. Air Force. She actually joined the Air Force at the age of 16. Now, I think for a lot of people out there, you wonder how did that happen? Well, she managed to get through school fast, and her mother signed the paperwork allowing her to enter the Air Force. And eventually she ended up being an instructor and was doing quite well, but then she made the mistake, at least from the Air Force vantage point, and I'm not going to argue this one and say that it's the rights or wrong of it, but she ended up posing for Playboy magazine. That was, I believe, 2007. And when she did that, she angered a lot of people in the military. In fact, it might have gone better for her had she instead at that point went forward and just simply said to her superiors, this is going to happen with some lead time. But she did not inform them that she was going to be appearing in Playboy until just about a month before publication. And unfortunately, the initial response was, well, probably not a problem. But after some discussion with superior officers, it was decided that they could not have her instructing younger airmen after the airmen had actually seen her naked in the magazine, or near naked. So at that point, a decision was reached, and she was told, sorry, we don't need you any longer. And she was discharged from the Air Force after 14 years, 6 years of getting her 20 years in. Since then, she has become somewhat of an entrepreneur. She does a little acting. She does some acting on a television soap opera. I am not sure which one. I read about it yesterday. I don't watch them, so I can't. The name didn't mean anything to me. But she has, if not a regular role, she has a recurring role on a soap opera. And she also has opened a restaurant in Valdosta, Georgia, where she has been quite successful. She is what they call a vegan. Or vegan, is that the pronunciation? She is a member of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. And so, in fact, some of her Playboy pictures, she was photographed with the flag draped over her body. On the other hand, if you appreciate the human form, I don't think she did anything to harm the flag. She may have actually enhanced the American flag in some of these photographs. I don't know that draping the American flag over your shoulders somehow is a desecration. I don't believe so. So to recap, late last week, she was working at her restaurant when the daughter of a friend, and this is a friend of hers who happens to be a veteran as well, the daughter of a friend came into the restaurant and told her what was taking place on the campus. And at that point, she decided she was going to leave some other people in charge at the restaurant. She raced to the campus, and that's when she snatched the American flag from these students who were walking all over it while it was on the pavement. And that led to the run-in with campus police. And as I say, she was wrestled to the ground, handcuffed, taken away. Police returned the flag to the students, and apparently students resumed walking atop the flag. No charges have been filed simply because the police, as I said, they don't want the publicity, the bad publicity from this, because a veteran trying to save a flag from desecration, you don't want really to have that person sitting in jail for 30 days. And the students didn't want to press charges as well. In fact, they wouldn't talk to reporters at the scene as all of this was going on. But you understand that the campus, the administration has since said that this woman is barred from ever being on the campus again. Now, they're saying that, and I think you have to understand what's going on here. They're saying that because apparently people are deeply offended by what she did. Here's the thing, though. On these modern campuses, what you have going on, and I think most people are fully aware of this, you have people, being offended is what they do there. And every time there's an offense, you usually have to get rid of the person who is being offended. Well, if she's offended, it doesn't matter because she's a veteran. You see what I mean? It doesn't work in the same direction for her. So if you're offended by the flag being desecrated, that's okay. If you're offended because someone on campus is showing American Sniper, that's not okay. You understand where I'm coming from. Yesterday afternoon, the Washington Post put up a story online at its website. And the Post was saying that this woman, we shouldn't, as conservatives, and isn't it great that the Washington Post is instructing conservatives on what to believe? The Washington Post says, we as conservatives should not respect this woman because, number one, she posed for Playboy some years ago, and number two, she's a member of PETA. Well, number one, on my count, I don't take instruction from anyone in liberal media. And two, when I look at that story, I realize some of the people who actually run the editorial board at the Post wouldn't be interested in looking at a naked woman anyway. You can fill in the blanks on that one as to what their persuasion might be in that particular situation. I would not want a woman in my own family appearing nude in a magazine. But on the other hand, I really don't care. I mean, I don't buy it. I don't read it. I don't look at the pictures. I really don't care what someone else actually does. And perhaps for a paycheck, a big paycheck that was involved with it, might be why she did it. It might have allowed her to buy the restaurant that she owns today. And so for that reason, I am not going to sit here and say, well, gee, she's a bad person because of what she did a decade ago. It might have been poor judgment, but I'll leave it at that. What she did in Georgia by rescuing that American flag was the right thing to do. And it really doesn't matter what she did 10 years ago or 20 years ago or 25 years ago. She stood up and did the right thing last week. And unfortunately, the fact that the campus says the students have a right to trample all over this flag and that can offend anyone else on the right, that's the part that really bothers me. Now, I got a great telephone message yesterday from a fellow who happened to be listening to this discussion on air, and he actually decided to call the campus. And he checked this all out, but he actually provided me with a telephone number where you can reach the campus and you can lodge a complaint. And perhaps we need more Americans standing up and saying, you know what? We think this sort of stuff has to stop. If someone had actually done that to a flag on campus when I was a student 30-some years ago, they would have been expelled. It certainly would have happened back in the 1960s, but they would have been expelled as recently as the early 1980s. Today, it's celebrated. Students are allowed to go ahead and do this. And as I say, the people who actually stand up for that symbol are the ones who are disparaged in media and on campus. But I have a telephone number, and I'll give you a moment to get a pen or a pencil and maybe some paper to write this down, because the caller who left me the message yesterday urged us to call this campus. And he wants us to let them know what we think about this situation. So if you've got the writing instrument, as they call it, ready, this is the telephone number you could reach. 229-333-5674. 229-333-5674. If you're still scrambling for a pen or pencil, I'll give you another minute to find that. And we'll give the number out again in just a couple of minutes. Bill Colley with you on Top Story today on News Radio 1310 KLIX. Also, you can hear us online everywhere, all around the world, at newsradio1310.com. You can just click on Listen Live, and you can hear what we're talking about. If you're on the road and you're in a hotel somewhere and you're away on business, but you'd like to keep track of what's going on back home, there's your opportunity. And so, hey, I read some statistics not long ago that in Canada, nearly a quarter of all of the radio listening now is being done online. In Los Angeles, the top talk station, from what I understand, 51% of the listenership is now online. So we're seeing, and in Norway, they're dropping the FM band altogether, primarily because of those reasons. But we'll story on that for another day. It's 8:18, and you're on the air with Bill Colley on Top Story. What's on your mind?
Listen, even though I don't agree with what they're doing, the Supreme Court ruled that they can do that. So it's like, whether you like it or not, they have a right to do that. Although I don't like it, I don't agree with it, but they have a right to do so. That's the Supreme Court.
Yes, and I'm fully aware of that. And you know what? It still doesn't make it right. Thank you very much for the call, sir. Why don't we all just line up, go out and tell our young children, you know what? Urinate on that flag. Have some fun. Because the court says you can. You're up next, and you're on the air on News Radio 1310 KLIX.
Hey, Bill, I just would like to know if that flag that they stepped on and desecrated our flag, I wonder if it was an ISIS flag, what would happen? What do you think would happen to the people that did it? You believe that?
There's an old Warner Brothers cartoon where Daffy Duck is running away from a character out of Arabian Nights, and the character has a great big scimitar and says, "Hassan Chop!" Well, that's what they might be looking at Valdosta State right now.
Yeah, that's what I had to say. Thanks.
Thank you much for the call, sir. Yes, just because the court says it's okay to do all sorts of things does not make it right. Right and wrong are something we know in the pits of our own stomachs. And again, the campus, if you walk down the campus and you offend some liberal by looking at them cross-eyed, they'll expel you for that or send you off to sensitivity training, that is, re-education camp. But if you offend somebody who's a patriot, well, that's okay. 49, Bill Colley with you. It's 8:20. Steve Millington will be along in about 10 minutes on Top Story. Once more, if you didn't get a chance to write that telephone number down and you wanted to give the campus at Valdosta State a telephone call and express your views about these students trampling the American flag and about the treatment of a veteran who tried to rescue it, if you have that pen, pencil, paper handy, maybe you're at a keyboard, but the telephone number, area code 229-333-5674. There you go. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. Steve Millington expected to join us in just a few minutes. I do want to mention my good friends at Western States Bus Services, where they're hiring part-time bus drivers right now. Split shifts, 5 days per week. Summer's off, and scheduled no school days. The pay is $10.75 per hour. You could apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Also, coming up tomorrow, we have some good folks coming in from Trip Family Medicine. That's located right here in Twin Falls. We call it Better Health with Trip Family Medicine. And we've been able over the last few weeks during that segment of the program, I think, to actually answer a lot of questions for people who have the occasional question about health issues. And we'll be seeing someone drop by tomorrow as well, one of the medical professions will be coming in. And we're going to be talking about the YMCA Healthy Day that's coming up shortly. Some details about that, and just how you can talk better about not only your overall health or just exercise eating better and getting regular checkups. So details on all of that coming up tomorrow on Better Health with Tripp Family Medicine, which is located across from the main post office on Fillmore Street in Twin Falls. Remember, life's too short not to feel good. You know, this whole story about the flag desecration, it really does show us how we have two separate Americas. You have an America that believes in some traditional values, and then you have the other America that feels victimized and feels that everyone else owes them some reparations. There are columns in two different newspapers. The Washington Times is a mouthpiece for Washington conservatives. The Washington Post is a mouthpiece for the far left in Washington. Columnist Dana Milbank at the Post the other day was writing about the split in America and how the partisan divide just keeps growing and growing and growing, and we may someday be looking, who knows, perhaps at civil war between the right and the left in this country. And then this morning, over at the Washington Times, the former editor of that newspaper, Wesley Pruden, he has a column where he talks about the very same thing. And he said, of course, our founding fathers wanted nothing to do with this. Washington warned against political parties, but this is what we have. And, you know, we're going to come to more than just blows. It's going to come down to more than just somebody trampling a flag and someone trying to take it away from them. That's been going on for 50 years now. But the belief among both of these people, and these are trusted men, these are old-time newspaper people in Washington, call them trusted men. I don't know about that when you say newspaper. I know. As it is, though, you're getting a view from the right and the left, and they're saying the same thing. That is the only thing that could potentially unite this country would be the outbreak of a war that would involve us globally. And then a lot of these people would have to, on the left, would have to just shut up and sit it out, or at least get involved with fighting that before we go back to the partisan divide. Now, speaking of that, I went to bed last night with a very queasy feeling about what could be happening. And we could be having some different conversations, very different conversations on this radio show in the coming weeks, depending on what may figuratively and literally blow up in some parts of the world. But we'll talk about that on another day. But I think it's fascinating to see that recognition that there is this tremendous divide in this country. And we see it in talk radio. Some people accuse us of actually amplifying it, but I'll tell you right now, I think, no, that's not the case. I think that this has been a good outlet for a lot of people. And, you know, people who actually call up a radio station and it's a bloodletting, they used to call it. When they get a chance to vent about something sometimes, it actually, I think, is good for the psyche. And it just allows them to blow off the steam, and I think that's a good thing in the long run. The left doesn't really have that. That's why I guess they're so dang angry all the time. You're up next. It's 8:28. You're on the air with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.
Good morning, Bill. That phone number that you gave works down at Valdosta, Georgia there. And they send you over to the Student Affairs office. And there's a lady there named Mickey Charlie, who is not in the office right now, but she is willing to call you back and talk to you about what they did.
Excellent
information.
I think, and I think once they get a feel for how people feel about this around the country, that you know, maybe they'll be more judicious in the future, I would think, when it comes to how they treat veterans on campus.
It doesn't matter how they treat veterans. It's any American citizen is what they're doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I thank you much for the telephone call, and thanks for calling them too as well. As I speak, the video of her arrest and takedown by the campus police was just playing on the Fox newscast this morning. This story is going to be with us, I think, for quite some time, and there's also a photograph of the students. Here's the thing. The newspaper people did not photograph the students from the knees up. They don't want us to know who the little rats are, I guess. 8:30. Bill Colley with you this morning on Top Story. Steve Millington will join us in just a moment. He is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. He's a little bit more mild-mannered than I am. That's ahead after some fine messages from some of our fine sponsors. The guest that I have in studio going to be talking a little bit of legislative politics, I suppose, today. But he may also be talking a little bit, too, about some national issues, because we have a lot of talk going on in the Republican Party now about especially who's going to be the choice for the next president of the United States. I think we're up to 147 candidates.
at least.
Steve Millington is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party, in studio with me, Bill Colley, this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as online at newsradio1310.com. Can we quickly, you were listening to the conversation about the flag desecration.
Right.
And, I think your point being that you'd probably go the same route that she went if somebody was doing that.
I think I would. True. The freedom of speech clause says that we have this freedom to do these various things. That doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean that I should have to tolerate it. It's just one more of these things where we completely destroy the fabric that we call United States of America. And I think that there's a tremendous amount of pressure from the left, from the liberals, from the progressives, from the socialists elements to destroy the thing that makes the United States great. And that flag represents the things that make this nation great.
There was a fellow I worked with back in the late 1980s, and he had led a big campaign at the time because flag burning, that was a huge issue. There was talk about a constitutional amendment. And Dick was a Vietnam veteran, and he was leading the charge locally on the radio. And I can remember he even got some national publicity in USA Today. And then another one of my friends ended up building a metal flag. And what he did is he said, he was asked why he did it. He called the media over. He threw some kerosene on it, threw a match out. All the flames went, and they went up, and there was the flag still standing there. And he said, "You can't destroy it." And he made USA Today as well. And so this whole debate was going on. But at the time, I was of the attitude, well, we shouldn't stop people from doing it. It's their right. And then I got another job at a radio station, and one of my first interviews was with a group of veterans from who'd survived Iwo Jima. And when they sat down and they told me what it meant to them when they saw that flag raised on Mount Suribachi, I totally changed my tune on all of this. And I realized just how important that flag is to a great many people who bled and died for us.
Yep.
And so for that reason, I don't have any respect for anyone who would do anything like that.
Yeah, it's a representation of the patriotic valor that every one of us should. You try that in Russia with their flag,
yeah,
or you try that in any other nation with their flag. And you're going to pay a horrible, awful price. Mm-hmm. And yet at the same time, why do we put up with it here?
I just, I realize that everyone says it's not very civil to give someone a knuckle sandwich in these situations, but I do think it is a deterrent sometimes. We have a caller with us, Steve Millington, our guest in studio on Top Story, and you're on the air.
Good morning. We just go back to Fort McHenry that brought about our national anthem. How many people died there at Fort McHenry to make sure that flag was up there? Because at dawn's early light, the flag was still there, and the British had homed all of their cannons to bring that flag down. And that flag represents so much more than just colors flying in the breeze. It represents what this country is all about.
That's exactly right. And how many times do we say the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America. And it's a crucial thing. Now, 150 years ago, on April 9th, I think it was, the Civil War ended. And one of the interesting things in the Pledge of Allegiance is that we use the words indivisible, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Now, you take out those three phrases and apply them to your life and ask yourself very quietly and succinctly if I really believe that it is indivisible and that it is a nation under God with liberty and justice for all. You would be an idiot to trample it underfoot.
And you know what? That Pledge of Allegiance and the words on that really represents, I think, a number of things. It ties in the Constitution, our oath to the Constitution. It ties in the the Declaration of Independence, and the values of our founders. All of that is all wrapped up into that pledge and the flag.
In that one succinct little message that we can recite, we should be able to recite it from memory, and yet it pledges so many things about what makes us as individuals strong and confirm and free to do the things that we feel best for us. Not free to trample on someone else's rights, but at least free to do the things that I desire to do for myself.
We've got more with Steve Millington coming up. He is the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. He joins us on Tuesday mornings between 8:30 and 9 o'clock. You're listening to Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. 51 now at our studios. Going to get to be a warm day before it's all over. Joining us in the studio this morning, Steve Millington. He's the chairman of the Twin Falls County Republican Party. It's 8:43, 51 at our studios. Bill Colley with you on Top Story on News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. That means you can listen to us anywhere around the world. In fact, I got a note from my friend Patrick, who's a retired undercover federal narcotics investigator. He says the reason that this goes on with the flags is because people just don't have the stones to go up and do what they need to do.
Yeah. That's exactly. And without that, and I recognize that the flag is merely identified as a symbol, but it's more than just any symbol. It is a special symbol. And without that flag, where would all these people and all of their self-righteous indignation about I can do whatever I want, where would that be?
Yeah.
Why don't they just go to China or to Russia and try that little maneuver for 5 minutes and see how well it's received? And we could list hundreds of other nations that have absolutely zero tolerance in regard to that kind of stuff. We need to revere it and respect it. And more than that, we need to honor it with our own efforts and our own allegiance, so to speak, to make this country better than it was yesterday and not quite as good as it's going to be tomorrow.
We'll take one more call on this topic, and then we've got some politics, too, as well to talk about.
Politics is no fun.
And you're on the air with Steve Millington and Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX. What's on your mind?
See, there's times when you feel like there's no hope. Like if you listen to an environmentalist where, eventually there'll be no food, the heat will kill us, the seas will rise, and we're just headed straight to hell, and what's the point? And then even some days, I love Glenn Beck to death, but, go ahead, he talks about how we're headed for a financial crash, and he may be true, but it may not be as soon as he thinks. But there's times when you get so damn depressed that you say to yourself, what the hell's the use? And if you inform your children, and if they, for instance, they believe that the world really is going to end environmentally, or that America will never be what it was, these children lose their hope. So you see, we've got to fight back to show them that there is hope, and that there is America can stand strong. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a situation where we are inevitably doomed. And so, you see, when a lady does this and the left mistreats her, and even the police are militarized to a point and mistreating her with this flag down in Georgia, you say to yourself, man, I called down there yesterday to Valdosta State University, and I got through to the general line, and I says, I want to talk to somebody about what happened with this flag. She says, well, sir, we have a dedicated line for that. When I called that line, I couldn't get through. See, when we do this as patriots and call in and state our case, they have to defend it, and they don't get away with it. And you see, there really is hope in the future for America, and things aren't as bleak as they seem. And we need to let our children know that. Thanks.
Amen, brother. That's a good point.
And you know what?
There is always hope, and we must never give up.
They roll you over to the dedicated line, and Press 1 if you'd like to.
Yeah,
Press
right.
2.
I think that university got a wake-up call when all of a sudden there was such a firestorm kickback. What are you people doing down there? And I think that's exactly, our caller's right. That's exactly what we've got to call them out on this kind of unacceptable behavior.
I could never imagine this happening at CSI.
I would hope not. Boy, I would sure hope not. Holy Moses.
Some of those kids would come out of the rodeo barn and lasso these SOBs and
drag them off.
Sit them atop a bull and say, have fun.
Yeah, have a nice day.
It's a different mindset here.
And I think that's one of the advantages we have living in this area, this community. We do have a mindset that is not, has not been completely destroyed by these goofy leftist ideas. And our caller had a good point. We have to teach our children that there is always hope and that there can be a better and brighter tomorrow, and that we teach them that with the understanding and the idea that they too will carry on this idealism.
I wanted to point out, we were talking off-air via email earlier this morning about some national issues. Hillary Clinton could end up going to prison after some allegations made in a new book that's coming out, which really would open up the Republican opportunity next year. I just caught a little bit about this book. It's not being heavily reported yet, but she may have actually taken bribe money while Secretary of State.
They're not going to call it a bribe, but the fact remains that certain international foreign country interests put money into the Clinton Foundation, which she is one of the directors or administrators thereof. And some of these things, you can't just sweep this kind of stuff under the rug and say, oh my, it never happened. They're going to try, but we can't let that happen.
But if the Secretary of State was then turning around and making
special deals,
right, for those countries for the donations, then that's a criminal enterprise.
That is. And quite frankly, Bill, the real question is, she's Secretary of the State, and they're getting these kinds of contributions from external foreign countries. That's a conflict of interest, a blatant, clear conflict of interest. And wow.
And all the media wants to do is talk about, her fun bus tour or van tour last week.
Yeah, right.
So, apparently they've already said there's no story left with the emails. But it's going to be interesting because if this book can be backed up, I would think that she will not continue this campaign. I think that she'll just suddenly throw in the towel and try to make some sort of deal to stay out of prison. Because if it's true, that's where she'll go.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Her husband could go too as well if he was a party to this, because he was getting big speaking fees, and also decisions were being made on behalf of those people who were paying the big speaking fees.
Yeah, oh dear.
It's like Juan Perón and his wife Evita. They just were there to fatten their wallets.
And they did a good job of that, by the way. It's at the expense of everyone else in Argentina.
The 2 weeks from today, I think it is, or pretty close, we're going to have an announcement from Mike Huckabee, who says he may or may not run. The New York Times said yesterday, do not take him lightly. Of course, we listen to him every day here on the show, but they said do not take him lightly, that he is going to command a huge presence because evangelicals who back him up still are a huge part of the Republican Party.
They really are, and they have. And keep in mind that these vetting that we go through approaching the primary elections is basically the more vocal and committed portions of the party, and so we say, okay, who's Mike Huckabee? Well, I got news for you. Huckabee's one of these kind of guys who does have a very large presence in a community of people who will be really involved in the primary process. Now, many folks will just kind of stand on the sidelines and watch the whole thing go by, but these people will be absolutely committed to their cause, and they will put a great deal of money and time and effort into their candidate, Mr. Huckabee. And I think it would be foolish to just discount him.
I was going to say, he's been one of the biggest backers of Israel, and if this situation with Iran, which looks like it could boil over into war any day now, if this happens, he'll be vindicated along with a great many other people. This is where I think that he could shoot up in the polls. I read this morning that Jeb Bush is at 17%, so he's the leader of all the people so far.
Right.
But I got thinking about that. That may be the only 17% Jeb Bush will get, and as we see the field sort of winnows, that somebody else will surpass him.
That's exactly right. This morning on one of the email blogs that I get, they had this. I clicked on it to read the story, and up pops this page and said, "Okay, which one of these 16 people would you vote for president?" And I get that 2 or 3 times a day, and I just I'm tired of it. But this morning, I just looked through all the names, and I thought to myself, why do so many people want to do this? Well, because there's an awful lot of money available for a candidate, and you have to set up the appropriate campaign financing regulations, and you have to register with the election commission, and so that all the money goes in here. They could keep track of, number one, where it came from, and number two, what did you do with it? Where did you spend it? There's a lot of money there, and if you have something left over at the end of the deal, you've got $5, $10, $20 million left in your campaign account. You can use that for political type activities, but at the same time, you can do it in such a way that you really continue to keep your name in the public eye and create a lot of interest in you being a former candidate or perhaps a future candidate. So I looked at a lot of the names and I thought, what are these people doing? Well, they're trying to build a presence so that they can get lots of speaking fees. And you go down and look at of all the names, and you say to yourself, well, this is interesting. I kind of like this list. This has got all kinds of people. What's Peter King, congressman from New York? They say he's going to announce for president. I beg your pardon. What are you talking about here? Lindsey Graham, he's a nice guy from South Carolina, but go back to South Carolina. He hasn't had a stellar performance in the United States Senate. So give me a break here. Now, we do have a couple of 3 interesting things. Rand Paul, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio. They're all first-term United States senators. We've got one of those right now, and it hasn't worked out quite so well for us. So those guys might want to take a second look at what in the world is going on. There's some that I have a fascination for that are never going to make it to the end of the road. I like Ben Carson. He has a common sense, pure, simple kind of this is the way we get things done attitude. Carly Fiorina, she ran a Hewlett Packard. She has a pretty good understanding of how we make things work, but she has very little political experience. So she's going to get thrown off the bus real quick. Bobby Jindal from Louisiana. Now, everybody has, we have this Religious Freedom and Restoration or Reformation Act or whatever it is. I can't remember all the words, but Indiana tried it and they had to slam down and had to reverse it and change the rules. One other state had the same.
Arkansas.
Yes, thank you. Well, they tried that same thing in Louisiana, and IBM sent a nasty letter and says, we have this great facility in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and we think this would be awful for our people. And Jindal sent them back a letter and says, you do not understand what this bill is. You do not understand Louisiana politics, and let me take a few moments and help you understand how this works. And he laid it out for them. He said, ours is not to discriminate against people. Ours is to see to it that never are they under any duress in the state of Louisiana. And I thought to myself, these other governors would have been well advised to do the same thing. You folks need to shut up and let us run our state.
He may be the smartest guy in the Republic. He was always the smartest guy in class, from what I understand, when he was growing up. And so he's got an ability to sort of put that all together and say it that way.
You listen to him in speaking, and you say to yourself, he looks like to me he's reading a pre-written script.
Yes.
But he isn't. There's nothing there, not even a teleprompter. Heaven forbid, how do we do these things without a teleprompter? But he'd just get up there and just lay it right straight out. And I've thought, whoa, this old boy's...
When he took over as governor, I had a friend who was working with FEMA there right after the hurricane.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, in his district, they got all the relief they needed. He took care of that individually. But he said that all the guys standing behind him, all the old cronies, he said they all had terrible looks on their faces because within 6 months they were all indicted. He got rid of all that old chaff.
He threw them all out. So it'll be interesting for the next up till fall. But by the time August, September show up, we're going to have this list whittled down to 3 or 4 real strong players.
Yeah, and then it'll get exciting. I remember those last 6 months back in 2012. We had Gingrich, we had Romney, and we had, I believe, Santorum all still in it.
Yep.
And just to hear the 3 of those guys go back and forth, it was, if you love politics, it was wonderful.
Wow, it was exciting, wasn't it? Well, we're going to have an interesting summer, I can tell you that.
We'll see you again next week.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Steve Millington joining us in studio. I believe Grant Loebs is going to join us next. We're going to talk a little law right here on News Radio 1310 KLIX, as well as newsradio1310.com. It's 52 at our studios. We have another guest in the studio with us during this hour of the program, and of course he's a familiar name to people across the area. Grant Loebs is the Twin Falls County prosecutor and joins us about once a month in studio to talk about some legal issues and the like. First of all, I'd like to say welcome back.
Thanks. Good to be here.
In fact, you see more of Steve Millington than I do, too, as well, apparently.
I just see him at various meetings. We happened to be at a meeting last night.
What do they call that? The chicken circuit, right? Chicken dinner circuit.
I think it was actually pork last night. Yeah, it was pork loin.
Well, we're going to take a few minutes to talk about some legal issues, as well as if anyone has a question or comment for Mr. Loebs while he's in the studio with us this morning. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story with Bill Colley. And right now, 53 at our studios, looking for a high today in the mid-70s, and 8 minutes after 9 o'clock. We were having a short conversation off air a few minutes ago about the governor's veto of a bill that, boy, it got emotional. And this is where sometimes when you're making law, you'd like to stay away from the emotional. This was that, what do they call it, cannabinoid oil? Medical
Cannabinoid
marijuana?
oil, yeah. It's a product derived from marijuana. And you're right, it was an emotional issue. And certainly nobody that I saw debate this wanted to take anything away from the families and obviously from the victims of this epileptic disorder that was at the heart of this particular bill. And for those of your listeners who might not know exactly what we're talking about, there's a potential, and a lot of people believe it's a reality, that certain parts of the marijuana plant have medicinal value specifically to treat epileptic disorders. And this cannabidiol oil is derived from marijuana. And of course, the problem is that marijuana is illegal, both in Idaho and, of course, it's federally illegal, and there's nothing Idaho can do about that. And so the proposed bill was to allow people to possess, at least as far as Idaho law is concerned, this marijuana oil. It has a small amount, at least it's supposed to have a small amount of the intoxicating chemical that's in marijuana, and then the rest of it is supposed to have this medicinal quality. And that was the reason for the emotional debate. I mean, obviously, a lot of the supporters of this bill had either children or relatives who had this disorder, and they were seeking to have this treatment to be made legal in Idaho. But that it's a really a big problem, because by making something legal in Idaho, you still can't legally possess it because it's a federal crime to do so. It's also a federal crime to manufacture it and to distribute it and everything else. So that was kind of where the battle lines were drawn on that. And of course, both the House and the Senate, the House more narrowly than the Senate, passed that legislation, and then the governor vetoed it.
The governor made a point, too, and I was reading on the AP wire where he said, I think that his main reason was there is no evidence. And he felt, obviously, for these families, too, because some of the stories that they're telling are gut-wrenching about what they go through, and it's got to be difficult when you have a special needs child. But he said no one had provided any evidence that this actually worked, and that was a concern to him.
Right, and of course there have been all sorts of tests over the years on marijuana, and some have shown some mild medicinal effects, and a lot, of course, that we read about in the paper have shown all kinds of harm that marijuana does. And the proponents of this bill said, well, there's anecdotal evidence that this helps, and the problem with that is that there was another bill in the House and in the Senate. Actually, it passed the Senate unanimously. It was sponsored by Senator Lee Hyder from Twin Falls, which provided for a very large study, which would include all the families in Idaho with children with this disorder, to be, certified by the FDA to look at the actual drugs that can be made from marijuana to treat this epileptic disorder, and would be monitored by, doctors and pharmacists and people who would mix this drug in a clinically safe way. And that bill didn't even get a hearing in the House because the chairman of the House committee wanted the medical marijuana bill to pass, and so he didn't even give this one a hearing. The governor in his veto message indicated that he was going to, by executive order, provide funding for that study. So for the families of those children, it's not all bad news that the governor vetoed that, because now there will be a clinically safe way of testing virtually the same drug.
So he has a heart. We want to point that out. I mean, the governor Otter is not looking. He's just not out there saying we're just going to, leave these people high and dry.
Right.
That's important.
He's certainly provided another avenue, and I think a safer one.
We have a caller with us, and you're on the air with Grant Loebs joining us this morning in studio on Top Story. What's on your mind?
Well, I had a question for Grant. I heard a rumor that this yahoo that was shooting up the assisted living place there a month and a half, 2 months ago, got the charges dropped. Is that true?
Well, as always, I can't comment about ongoing cases, but occasionally charges are dropped because further investigation is being undertaken, and sometimes charges which are dropped are refiled. And I think that's all I'll say about that case.
All right. I want to thank the caller for chiming in this morning. And of course, if someone has a question or comment today for the prosecutor, you can reach us at 736-0300. That is 736-0300. This is Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. Right now it's 54 at our studios, 9:14. And that's one thing that I think people realize. You have a very delicate balancing act sometimes, because when you're dealing with courts, it comes down to you have to really parse your words sometimes. I have seen cases where sometimes in just somebody's talking outside a courtroom, cameras rolling and people taking notes, and you might use one word and that word gets twisted around. I mean, the law is a very complex thing.
Right, and of course, in my job, there are ethical guidelines, there are requirements, and there are guidelines that we establish for ourselves to make sure that we don't endanger an investigation. But anybody who's accused of a crime has constitutional rights, and those rights really do guide what we do when we prosecute them. So the caller had a good question. I'm not in any way belittling the caller's concern, but hypothetically, if somebody was accused of something, and maybe there were charges filed, or maybe they were even arrested, and the prosecutor doesn't have enough evidence to go forward on a particular day, occasionally it's necessary for charges to be dismissed, for further investigation to be done, for charges perhaps to be refiled. And until we're at the end of an investigation, or until a case is officially closed, or until there is a conviction and all the appeals have run their course, it's difficult for a prosecutor or a policeman or a sheriff to make detailed statements about a crime, because obviously any statements they make will come back, and perhaps make difficulty for the case.
I have a friend who told me the story about he was a wealthy businessman, and he was involved in a civil case, and he said I lost $7 million one time because of the lack of a period in a sentence. So, yes, you have to be very careful about what you're doing.
The details will be taken down by somebody and used in the most disadvantageous way. And, we in the profession, we all understand that, and the police understand that, and the prosecutors and judges understand that, but citizens don't understand it because there is always necessarily information left out of a story, and sometimes I would really like to get on the radio or stand on the street corner and tell people what's really happening about a thing, but I know to do that will endanger my ability to get a conviction or to do justice in a particular case for a particular person.
We used to call it, in fact, when I was working in news, we called it cop speak, and when they're writing reports. And I remember from a pre-law class in college, one of our instructors explained to us the reason it's done that way is because you're not there to write Shakespeare. You're trying to be thorough. You're trying to be understood. In fact, yesterday I was reading a story about there was a tragedy in Baltimore last week where a fellow arrested died after being taken to the hospital, and the police report was cited. And you read the language, and it seems long and convoluted and technical, but it's technical for a very important reason, isn't it?
Right. I mean, the policeman's job in investigating a case is to provide a dispassionate listing of all of the criteria that make up the crime, that make up the event, that allow the prosecutor to then analyze that report, find out whether there was a law violated, what law was violated, how it was violated, and then be able to write the charging language carefully and accurately, because whatever is written in that policeman's report and written in the charging language is what has to be proven when we get to court. And so it's not the job of the policeman to say, man, this is the worst bank robbery I've ever seen. This guy is awful. I mean, he's horrible. He should, get the following punishment and, stand up and do a press conference and say, this guy needs to go to prison forever. That doesn't do anything to help the process along. Sometimes it feels good to say those kind of things, especially when you see some really atrocious activity. But the more you give in to that kind of emotional temptation to get out and say something that feels good, the less chance you have of doing the right thing later on.
You can say that after the conviction, but before the conviction, you may harm that conviction.
Exactly.
And that's what I think sometimes.
And you might actually be wrong early on, and you might say, this is the worst guy ever, and if it turns out a few weeks later you get evidence that it was another guy that did it, and that guy isn't actually the worst guy. So it's a situation where caution is you
don't want to make life miserable for the wrong person.
Exactly.
Yeah. We need to point out we've got a break coming up in about a minute. I was going to mention, I was talking off air with Grant Loebs about a column I saw from George Will a couple of weeks ago, and of course we've always had this adage, ignorance of the law is no excuse, but Will is saying that the law may be becoming so complex now that people perhaps in the future could be using such a defense. The public just has a difficulty, I think, sometimes keeping up with certain changes and the like. We'll maybe talk a little bit about that, about responsibilities of citizens. We don't teach civics much anymore, and maybe if we did, maybe people would have a better grasp of all of that too, and be more aware of it. But we'll chat about that before we wrap up today. And I do want to point out you can reach the prosecutor by giving us a telephone call at 736-0300. But first, we're going to hear from some of our fine sponsors right here on Top Story on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. It's 20 after 9, 54 at our studios. Joining us in studio this hour is Grant Loebs, Twin Falls County Prosecutor. He's also taking some telephone calls if you're so inclined, if you've got a legal question for him. It's coming up on 924, 55 at our studios. We seem to rise a degree about every 5 minutes here. No complaints about that. Bill Colley with you on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. The show is Top Story. And the telephone number 736-0300. You can email me as well at bill.colley@townsquaremedia.com. We were talking about this situation of laws. There's so many laws on the books anymore. I was listening to Ted Cruz do an interview the other day about tax law, and he now says there are more words in our tax law than there are in the Bible, and everyone got a chuckle out of that during the course of his interview. But we build laws upon laws, and we have this precedent that goes on. And George Will had this column a couple of weeks ago, and I happened to be reading it, where he said that he believes that we've reached that point where there's just so much going on legally and so many laws that we've written that the public can't know all of this. And he said, so therefore that old adage, ignorance, you could never plead ignorance of the law, he said, that might start becoming a legitimate defense. What do you think about that vantage point?
Well, I think there's some truth to that. I mean, obviously, I don't know all of the law that there is. I don't know all the federal law. I don't know all the tax law. If I undertook to, if I had complex taxes, which I don't, fortunately, if I undertook to, work as a tax lawyer or as a citizen to file a complex tax return, I would have to research the law in order to know the law in a particularly technical kind of field like that. And I think that there is some difficulty there because, like Cruz said, the tax code is enormous. A lot of law, of course, is basically common sense and basically just using, generally accepted, values and decency. Most of the crimes that I prosecute people for aren't overly complex. I mean, don't take a gun and rob a pharmacy, don't stab somebody, don't shoot somebody, don't rape somebody. Those are pretty simple. Some of the more complex stuff tends to be in the white collar crime area. And of course, a lot of those people that are engaged in those kind of activities are also the kind of people that know that field. So while there is some truth to it, I think it's not something that we see very often in a county prosecutor's office. I think it's something that more federal prosecutors see. And I think that in some of those cases where there is a genuine ignorance of the law, which again is no defense, but if there's a genuine ignorance, that's a mitigating factor for sentencing and for punishment and for charging. So if I had an overly technical kind of law and I was prosecuting somebody for, I don't know, illegal dumping at a work site or something like that, and they said, wow, this is buried in footnote 9 on page 62 of the Federal Register. I didn't know this was illegal. I think there would be a lot of leeway for that person if that was genuinely true. But most criminal law, it's pretty standard stuff.
There's occasionally, I saw a TV show some years ago, and obviously it was fiction, but it was a fellow was arrested because they wanted to get him off the streets. He came into town and he was told that there was an old law in the books that said you have to have someone walking 10 feet in front of you announcing that a car was coming through town, which would have been one of those old laws from the early 1900s. And that was the nub of the show was that he had been arrested for this. Sometimes there may still be, I don't think we have that issue too much any longer, but there may still be some of these dusty old laws on the books, and they may come up sometimes. And you'd almost say that's a little bit of a cheap prosecution if you went ahead with something like that.
Yeah, and I don't know very many people that dust off those old things. Don't honk your car horn because you might scare the horse. Drive 4 miles an hour with somebody walking in front of the car. Don't do X, Y, and Z on Sunday. There are all kinds of things that might be buried in old statute. The legislature does from time to time clear some of those things out, but they fall into disuse the way anything that's old does, and prosecutors don't usually pay much attention to those, and certainly police don't.
Yeah, I think the police right now, in most cases, and a lot of people think that the police officer is just looking for them. And I think that may be more paranoia than anything else because there's just so much they have to do. And when you have to write so many reports about everything you do, the police officer would just like you to behave and just get out of his way, I think, in most cases.
Yeah, and obviously police patrol at all times of the day and night. And if they see you doing something that they believe is wrong, they'll stop you. If they believe that you're doing something suspicious, they might watch you for a little while to see if you're doing something wrong. But they're not going to give you a ticket for not driving 4 miles an hour and having somebody walk along with a lantern, to announce your way. But there are laws that are enforced, very infrequently, and sometimes there is a reason to enforce them in a given case.
Especially, there might be someone you do need to get off the street.
Yeah.
And one of those obscure laws would do the job.
Perhaps. I mean, and again, fortunately, we don't have much of that in Twin Falls, at least. And in Idaho, you read about a case once in a while.
If the law is not that old here, this city's not that old. That's probably why.
That might help.
We have more with Grant Loebs coming up, Twin Falls County Prosecutor. You're listening to Top Story. It's 9:30, 55 at our studios. This is News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com with Bill Colley. If you have a question or comment for Twin Falls County Prosecutor Grant Loebs, you can reach us. The telephone number is 736-0300. He's in studio with us through a couple of more segments. In fact, he'll take us right up to Mike Huckabee today. You know, Huckabee's going to be leaving that job. Are you interested?
No.
Yes.
I'm not interested in that job or the job he's leaving it to find.
Yes, that one's even going to be tougher if he does get it. 9:34. Right now, 56 at our studios. And I believe we have a telephone caller joining us. And you're on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Welcome to Top Story.
Hello. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm listening on a smartphone, but it's not smart enough to let me listen while I'm making the phone call, so I don't know if I'm behind. But you're still with Grant Loebs, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about President Obama's amnesty proposal. It seems to ride on prosecutorial discretion. What do you think about that?
Well, that's a different kind of prosecutorial discretion than I engage in, but what he is saying is, because he is the executive, and there are, as we know, 3 branches of government, because he is the executive, it is his job to decide how executive actions are taken. And the U.S. attorneys are his employees. The Attorney General is his employee. And he is saying that it is up to him and his Attorney General and U.S. attorneys to decide in their discretion who to prosecute and who to not prosecute for violations of illegal immigration. And so that's what he is talking about with regard to prosecutorial discretion. He's saying that as the guy who makes the decision at the top of the pyramid, he gets to decide for all of his prosecutors that we're not going to prosecute this sort of thing. Now, in Idaho and in the states, individual prosecutors exercise prosecutorial discretion, but they don't exercise the governor's discretion or the attorney general's discretion. They have their own discretion, and it reflects the values of their own communities. But that's what he's talking about, and it's a rather extreme application of that concept to say that in my job as president, my prosecutorial discretion is we're not going to prosecute people for this whole array of crime. But that's what he's talking about, and to a certain extent, that's of course true. I mean, each president who takes over has a different emphasis and sends out that different emphasis through his attorney general and his U.S. attorneys. And some are more excited about the war on drugs. Some are excited about use of illegal handguns. Some are excited about stopping gang crimes. And in this particular case, President Obama has decided that he's going to be unexcited about prosecuting illegal immigration.
I want to thank the caller for chiming in with us. We were talking off air a few minutes ago. A little bit of mix here, media and how media treats stories, and I think probably we've had a series of shootings involving police officers across the country, which normally, before the era of 24-hour news, may not have gotten nearly as much attention. After the media circus in Ferguson, Missouri, and we ended up with, I think, the media perhaps fanning the flames in that situation. And this is why you talk about being careful with what you say when you're in law enforcement. But we had a conversation off air about what happened in South Carolina, and you were telling me that how this police officer is charged really depends on state law. The degree of the homicide depends on state law. So it may vary from what it would happen in, let's say, Idaho.
Right. Each state has its own statutes, and that is a problem as we looked at what happened in Ferguson, what happened in Staten Island, what happened in South Carolina. We look at it and say, oh man, and I've seen the people commenting on TV. You know, I'm a prosecutor from California. I'm an ex-prosecutor from, you know, from Chicago. Well, unless you know what the law is in South Carolina or in Idaho, or unless you've researched that, you don't have any idea what you're talking about. Because the law that, for instance, the Ferguson grand jury looked at a law that's somewhat different from the Idaho law. So would Idaho law have applied differently? Perhaps. In South Carolina, I don't know what the South Carolina definition of first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter is. Um, and it's always dangerous to judge from a snippet that you see on TV, but I think that the challenge there is going to be for the prosecutor to show that there was either intent there or that it was a murder which resulted from a sudden quarrel or heat of passion, which is what second degree murder is or excuse me, or a voluntary manslaughter. And then so the question is in the interplay of those laws in that state. In Idaho, I could tell you, you know, what it looks like that crime is, but that doesn't have anything to do with South Carolina.
And that goes back to the old federal system. People
Right.
come up with their own laws.
And the state's laws aren't necessarily, they don't follow necessarily the federal definitions or even neighboring states' definitions.
Certainly some of the states in some parts of the country, too, will almost have a basis on Napoleonic code, as I understand it.
One state does for sure.
Yeah. In fact, we were talking about Louisiana just in the last hour. We've got more coming up with Grant Loebs, Twin Falls County Prosecutor. It's 56 coming up on 940. Some messages from some fine sponsors, too, on the way. You're listening to News Radio 1310, KLIX, and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story with Bill Colley. You're listening, of course, as the guy just mentioned there in that promo for our overnight programming. That would be Coast to Coast. You're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. This is Top Story with Bill Colley. Our guest has been this hour, Grant Loebs. He's spending a few more minutes with us. He is the Twin Falls County Prosecutor. And he's been taking some telephone calls, too, as well as reflecting on some other aspects of the law. We were just talking off air about, we opened our show today in the last hour talking about this case in Georgia where the veteran grabbed the flag that was being desecrated. And we were just talking off air. She was not charged with any crime because I think that goes back to that definition of discretion. No one wants to put anyone away in the lockup for being patriotic and maybe having that sort of emotional outburst in that situation.
Yeah, and as we were saying, you know, in everything a policeman or a sheriff's deputy does and out on the street, they have to use discretion. I mean, you don't find police who are wandering around town all day looking for every single possible infraction to cite somebody for because, you know, it would stop traffic, literally. But they have to use their discretion on when it's appropriate to act, when it's appropriate to get involved. In that case with the flag, obviously they believe they had to get involved because things could have gotten out of hand. But that doesn't necessarily mean you charge somebody with everything that it's possible technically under statute to charge them with. And I imagine if they had charged her with something, then the prosecutor would step in and have some discretion to use about whether they really wanted to go to trial on something like that. So, you know, discretion is something that in these jobs we have to use all the time. Otherwise, you know, you take out the human element, you might as well have robots doing all of this.
There is one aspect, though. I had a friend years ago. He left a job as a TV anchor because he wanted to be a police officer and ended up spending more than 20 years in that line of work. And when he finished up, he was chief in a small town department. And I remember him telling me, he said, in this day and age with the cameras we have mounted on the dashboards, he said, we've lost a lot of the discretion that we used to have because he said, in the morning, the sergeant comes out with a key and pops that tape. And he said, so he said, if you're on the road and you're pulling somebody over, he said, you have to be pretty well by the book anymore. He said, the old days when you had the discretion to say, well, all right, you're only a few miles over the limit, just keep it down. He said, that's pretty well gone now.
Well, I think that's still done. I mean, you know, every time a policeman, especially in a small town, and Twin Falls is still a small town in that way, every time a policeman stops somebody, they're not stopping them to give them a ticket and to make them pay, you know, a couple $100. If they believe that that it's, first of all, a minor infraction, obviously, and that more good can be done by giving the person a lecture, telling them what they were doing wrong, telling them the importance of not doing it again, and saying, I'm going to give you a warning this time, but keep it slow, or get your blinker fixed, or whatever. I think there are a lot of times, even with dash cams, that police do that, and it depends on department policy, of course.
I look back to when I was a kid, and the chief of police was our neighbor. He lived a few doors up the street, and on really cold days or rainy days, we would get rides in the police car to school. And on similar weather, we would get rides home in the police car because he'd pick up some of his own kids and the other kids from the neighborhood. That sort of stuff doesn't happen any longer today. We have changed things dramatically, and I don't know that it's always changed for the better.
Yeah, some of the small town stuff that used to be done was good. Some of the small town stuff that used to be done wasn't. For instance, we don't any longer pull a guy over who's drunk out of his mind and say, I'm going to drive you home and you can sleep it off, because we have a better understanding of what drunk driving is. We don't any longer go to a house where a man's beating his wife and say, okay, now, ma'am, you stay in the house, and I'm going to, tell this guy to walk around the block and cool off, and everybody will be fine. We don't do that anymore because we understand the danger of domestic violence. But, it still would be nice, I guess, if a policeman could give a kid a ride home in a raging hailstorm, and maybe that would still happen. I don't know. I mean, it depends on the policy. I mean, there's liability to think about too.
I did have that happen one time. I had broken a leg, and I was trying to get back in shape by doing a lot of walking at the time to get my ankle back in order. And I was a couple of miles away from the house still one day walking. This was when I was living in East Syracuse, New York. And all of a sudden, I could see these terrible clouds rolling in, and I thought, oh my gosh, I'm going to get soaked. And all of a sudden, up pulled a patrolman. He said, I'll give you a ride. Yeah. He didn't want me out there in the lightning, and I didn't want to be out there. So these things do happen from time to time.
And I think there's still an enormous amount of education and, in the broader sense, community protection that police engage in that doesn't involve always giving someone a citation or arresting them. I mean, you can often impress a kid who's doing something stupid. You can often impress them more by talking to them and saying, you could have gotten a ticket. You could have had your mom called to the police station, but I'm going to let you off this time. If I see you doing this again, we're going to have a problem. I mean, I think there's still a lot of that small town policing going on with individual policemen.
I want to thank you for coming by today, and we'll see you in about a month.
You bet. Thank you.
Grant Loebs is the Twin Falls County prosecutor joining us in studio. This morning, we'd like to thank him for dropping by. Mike Huckabee is up next, brought to you exclusively by the financial advisors at Waddell & Reed in Twin Falls. The telephone number, 736-6563. And Huckabee says that he will be making an announcement on May 5th. That's going to be, a Tuesday, I think that is. Is that a Tuesday or Wednesday? May 5th. Anyway, first week of May, on whether he intends to be a candidate for the presidency. But I think when you say you're going to make the announcement about your decision, then that likely means you're doing it. And as we've said earlier, he's already given the warning on air that when he makes the announcement, he has to step down from this position. So we'll be having someone else doing the Huckabee Report every day, so it'll be under a different name, but likely somebody who has very much the same ideology. Huckabee, and we should point this out, it is rare that someone in the New York Times has anything nice to say about a Southern Baptist minister. But there is a story at the New York Times where a writer says that Mike Huckabee is a very powerful force in the Republican Party and that he shouldn't be overlooked. And if you'd like to look this up, sometimes people will go and do a computer search on some of these things just to back up what I'm saying. The writer's name is Nate Cohn. He spells the last name C-O-H-N. And he says the most important name that you haven't heard much about in the Republican primary race is nonetheless a familiar one. Mike Huckabee, the former Arkansas governor who took the pageantry of presidential announcements to a nearly parodic level on Friday. Well, they have to say that. They're the New York Times. By appearing on national TV to announce that he would announce whether he would run on May 5th. He has demonstrated appeal to a crucial bloc, the writer says, of the Republican primary voters, the religious right. If he runs, he will be one of the most significant figures in the primary season with the ability to deny a crucial segment of voters or even states to another candidate. Now, right now, you have several of people who are vying for that very same voting bloc. You have Rick Santorum, who's obviously going to be getting back in again, and Bobby Jindal, and you've got Governor Huckabee. At some point, voters are going to have to settle on which one of those they like. Here's the thing. Over the course of the last several years, we have heard that the religious right is no longer a force in American politics, not like it was in the 1980s when Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Cal Thomas, by the way, was his public spokesman at the time, when they were really in the vanguard of American politics and leading, along with Ronald Reagan, that new revolution in conservatism. We're told that that no longer exists. So many Americans don't go to church anymore. They don't care. They're irreligious. That's why they don't care about our religious liberties. I would beg to disagree. Yes, you have a lot of people who were nominally Christian who perhaps aren't really Christian at all anymore. But the evangelical population, I think, is probably still the same percentage it was in 1985 as it is in 2015. And that means Mike Huckabee is a force. The other part of this is, after what happened with this pizza shop owner, practically martyred in Indiana because of her beliefs over same-sex marriage and not catering a same-sex wedding, after that happened, and if that continues, if that gay mafia continues to try and intimidate Christians in this country, you might actually see that force grow and become once again very, very powerful in American politics. And you know what? It's about time. It's about time someone pushed back. And these are the people who are perfectly set up to do that. And Huckabee, again, right now appears to be their leader. Of all of the candidates appealing to conservative Christians and evangelicals, he has, at the moment, the highest polling numbers. Speaking of faith, God willing, and the creek don't rise, I'm back in this seat tomorrow morning. We should note as well, tomorrow we are going to be joined once more by our good friends from Fripp Family Medicine. That'll be between 8:30 and 9 o'clock in the morning. Also, I'd like to remind you, my good friends at Western States Bus Services are hiring part-time bus drivers right now. Split shifts 5 days per week, summers off, and scheduled no school days. The pay is $10.75 an hour. You can apply today by contacting 733-8003. Western States Bus Services is an equal opportunity employer. Rush Limbaugh is coming up next following news from Fox at 10 o'clock. Sean Hannity following news from Fox at 1 o'clock. Glenn Beck following news from Fox at 4 o'clock. Dave Ramsey tonight. And then George Norrie on the overnight with the Anunnaki in studio again. Thanks for joining me.